Good morning and
Good
welcome
morning.
everybody to our virtual forum towards a common approach to sustainable supply chains and due diligence, which is organized by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. My name is Christine Tötzke. I am Director of our cooperation with the European Union and multilateral development policy in BMZ, and I have the pleasure to guide you through the next hours on this very important topic. The German government, as part of its EU Council presidency, has committed itself to the goal of working for corporate social responsibility. This is an important element for a sustainable economic and social recovery to overcome the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. What we need is a new strategy based on voluntary and compulsory governmental measures. The European Commission, too, in its work programme, has included an initiative on corporate social responsibility. Among other things, this includes European due diligence legislation. And with this virtual forum, we would like to contribute to the debate with representatives from governments, civil society, and businesses from all over the world. In our introductory session, two politicians are going to set the stage. We will start with Mr. Norbert Bartler, who is Parliamentary State Secretary at the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. He will inform you on German priorities and German activities. And he will then be followed by Mr. Didier Reynders, the EU Commissioner for Justice. State Secretary Bartler, you have the floor.
Thank you, Christine Tötzke, for your friendly introduction. Commissioner Reynders, ladies and gentlemen, filled with hope, we are following the daily news on the development of a vaccine against COVID-19, because this is the only way for us to regain our normal lives. After all, prevention is better than cure. This principle is not only true for vaccines, but also for sustainable global supply chains. How do we want to run our economies in the future is one of the key questions of our time. And the answer can only be in a socially and environmentally sound way. Human rights standards and environmental standards have to become established in global supply chains, and they have to be met. Sustainable business activities in global supply chains prevent human rights violations. Sustainable business activities give people a chance to enjoy a life in dignity. Sustainable business activities contribute to our environmentally and socially sustainable development. In practical terms, this means no child labor, more and better health and safety provisions, fair wages and a greater say for employees, and the development of resource-friendly, environmentally sound value chains. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us how vulnerable global supply chains are. The millions of people at the beginning of global supply chains are hit the hardest when the chains break down. They lose their jobs and incomes. They and their families are left with nothing. They have no basic social protection. We fear that this year alone, the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic will throw an additional up to 130 million people back into poverty and hunger. Sustainable supply chains are a matter of social responsibility, and they are in companies' interest. An enterprise that implements human rights standards and environmental standards invests in its competitiveness and thus in its own future. This idea is also at the heart of the national due diligence law that we are going to launch, with binding requirements for German companies. In our view, This law will complement your plan, Commissioner Reinders, to present a draft for EU legislation in 2021. That is why we have been using our EU Council presidency to work for an EU action plan to strengthen corporate due diligence obligations in global supply chains, a level playing field for all European companies, and increased support for our partner countries through development cooperation to help them develop sustainable value chains. Most people work at the beginning of global supply chains under poor labor and social standards in developing countries. More than 80 million boys and girls are working extremely hard in agriculture, growing cotton, harvesting cocoa. In our cooperation with our partner countries, we have been working for sustainable supply chains for a long time, for example, through our Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, the German Initiative on Sustainable Cocoa, and the Help Desk on Business and Human Rights. Implementing due diligence obligations in global supply chains is possible. The BMZ's Green Button Initiative, the first government-run label for fairly produced textiles, is proof of that. And it has also been confirmed by many authors of the compendium towards EU mandatory due diligence legislation. I would like to expressly thank all those who have helped to produce this document. My special thanks goes to the Business and Human Rights Resource Center for coordinating the project. I'm sure that the ideas, experience, and examples presented in the compendium will provide valuable input to the consultation process for EU due diligence legislation. And I'm equally sure that today's discussion will provide further input to the EU debate on European corporate due diligence legislation. Thank you very much, and good luck.
Thank you very much, State Secretary Bartley, for your opening speech in which you clearly stated the German priorities and ongoing activities in the field. You already mentioned the perspectives paper, which has been launched shortly before this virtual forum and will be discussed later in this conference. We will now turn to the European Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders. Commissioner, in its recently published work program, the European Commission announces that legislation on sustainable corporate governance will be proposed. Your DG also commissioned last year a comprehensive study on human rights due diligence legislation. So we are very keen to hear more from you. Commissioner, you have the floor. Commissioner, I think we cannot hear you. Could you unmute your microphone?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
It was done again. So I start again. So thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. And thank you for the first comments of the State Secretary about the evolution, of course, in Germany, but also in a broader sense. And ladies and gentlemen, many thanks for the German presidency for organizing such an important event today. And if you allow me, I want to start by reiterating what I said to the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights last week. The world needs a new global business model, a business model that is more equal, just, sustainable, and resilient. How to put this ethos into practice in the challenge facing policymakers and businesses today. And there is a sense of urgency which the pandemic has highlighted. To give an example, the International Cocoa Initiative estimated that child labor has increased by 20% this year. This is an additional 300,000 children in Ghana and the Ivory Coast alone, so just in two countries. The fact is that without legally binding measures, problems related to labor conditions, other human rights, as well as climate change, pollution and biodiversity are unlikely to be addressed successfully. Next year, it's true, we have announced it, I have said that already last year in my hearing before the European Parliament, the European Commission will adopt new horizontal guidance on sustainable corporate governance. The starting point is a level playing field, a minimum that can be extended if need be with specific sectorial rules. So we'll work on an horizontal basis, but of course it will be possible to go further in different sectors and also to go further in some national legislations. And when I'm speaking about a minimum with an ambition, of course, it's not to say that we will start with a very low level of requirements. We'll start with a real ambition, but at the horizontal level for all the different companies, the companies with limited liability, and of course with a specific attention to the SMEs. And the approach is twofold. First, I said to cover due diligence in supply chains with rules on social, human rights, and environmental due diligence in operations and value chains that ensure adherence to internationally recognized human rights and labor standards that build on the UN's guiding principles and, of course, OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and responsible business conduct, and contribute to other international commitments, including the EU's 2050 climate neutrality objective and the EU's biodiversity goals. Secondly, to clarify the duty of company directors. The aim is to ensure that board members consider wider stakeholder interest and the company's long-term interest as part of their duty of care. It will encourage businesses to frame decisions in terms of environmental, social, and human impact. And in turn, this will lead to a more sustainable business model. So we want to ask to the different directors and board to think about medium and long-term vision for the companies, and maybe in contrary with what we have seen in the last decades with the short-termism in many companies. It's very important to us to analyze the possible impact and risk of all the operations of the company on the environment, of course, also on the human rights, including some social situation. I want to take this opportunity to invite you to participate in the public consultation, which is open until February 2021. So it will be very important to receive a lot of contributions to prepare the next initiative. Because it is important that these rules are determined in an inclusive way with business on board. By doing the work at home, the European Union will put itself in a far stronger position in shaping the global agenda. If European companies set sustainability standards, they can be trailblazers internationally. If you are doing the job I said at home, it's possible to discuss with different partners in the same way. I don't want to make a comparison, but we have the same kind of issue about the rule of law. If we don't organize a real way to do the business at home, it's very difficult to explain what we are requesting to different partners in the candidate countries, but also in other kind of partnerships. The agenda for today's conference promises a very interesting discussion with much food for thought. I want to thank the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development again for organizing this event. For the European Commission, it is important to ensure that all voices are heard as we put our policy proposals together. And in this spirit, it is in the spirit that we are determined to work and find solutions for a more sustainable future. Again, I'm sure that after the consultation, it will be possible to come, I said, with such an horizontal approach. I know that we have already specific discussions in different sectors, like the textile sector, the minerals coming from the conflict, or I spoke about the cocoa sector. There are many other initiatives, but we want to have a set of standards at the EU level for all the companies, and then, of course, to be able to continue the discussion with different international partners, and I'm hoping that it will be possible to go also to another level of international regulation on this. But thanks again for this opportunity to present to you the way forward for the European Commission about a sustainable corporate governance. And again, we want to take on board all the different partners, also from the business community, but also from the trade unions, from the parliaments at the national and European level, and from different other actors. We are, for the moment, in a huge discussion about the consumer rights at the EU level. I have had yesterday and today many discussions in the European Parliament about that. And it's very important to change the behavior of the consumers in line with the sustainability of the products and the sustainability of our economy. But it's also very important to help different companies to change also their behaviors and to have a better vision on medium and long term about the sustainability of our economy, to be sure that it's possible to reach our goals, and not only the goals about human rights and social issues, but also the goal I said about the climate neutrality in 2050. So thanks again for such an opportunity, and thanks maybe again for your contribution today, and if it's possible, your contributions in the consultation that we have launched till February next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for these very comprehensive remarks, and we will definitely refer to them during the upcoming panels. Thank you for informing on the consultations. And I think with your starting sentence, the world needs a new business model, you might have created a slogan for today's virtual conference. Thank you very much for that. We will now start the next session, which will cover multiple perspectives from the Global South and the Global North. The key question is, what should and what could European decision makers do to improve working and living conditions along global supply and value chains? And of course, what role do European companies play? We will hear different voices from all over the world at two very interesting panels. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Phil Bloomer. Phil Bloomer is the Executive Director of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, BHRRC, which is based in the United Kingdom. The BHRRC is a digital platform that highlights the advances and abuses of human rights by businesses. It also has, together with BMZ, compiled a perspective paper, the already mentioned compendium, on mandatory rights and environmental due diligence on the European level. Phil Bloomer will present this compendium to you and also facilitate the following discussion. For this reason, I hand over to you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Christine. And thanks also to the German government for this opportunity to have this debate. We now move to two panels, as Christine said. The first will provide perspectives from the Global South on sustainable supply chains and on due diligence, and the second will provide those perspectives from the North. But before moving to the panels, please allow me just to introduce briefly the compendium of insights that's been referred to, which is from 22 decision makers and opinion formers across the world on Europe's due diligence initiative, which the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development and the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre launched last Friday. Together, we designed this compendium to highlight diverse, constructive voices from around the world. As such, it provides no unitary voice, but rather displays diverse yet convergent perspectives, which underline the many areas where there is now agreement and commonality, alongside some points of contention where greater dialogue is needed and where in the end the European Commission, Parliament and Council will need to demonstrate leadership to ensure that we have effective due diligence legislation. As Dr. Gerd Müller, German Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, has said, the time has come to introduce a binding framework for minimum requirements for corporate due diligence obligations and have impact along the supply chains. And I think Norbert Bertler really reinforced that message. The diverse voices in the compendium really emphasize 5 key points, which I'll just briefly go through. The first point is that voluntary implementation of the human rights and environmental due diligence is necessary but insufficient condition for change. A fact to back this up would be that 10 years after the UN Guiding Principles were agreed by consensus, The Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, launched last week for its 2020 report, states that half the largest companies in the sectors with the highest human rights risks score 0 on every single indicator for due diligence. So they don't even begin to register due diligence as an issue in their companies. A second point that the compendium highlights is that stakeholders need to be involved in the design and implementation of the mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence law. And we heard very strongly, I think, from Commissioner Reinders that that's going to be very much part of it. A fact to back this is that at the moment, the 2020 Know the Chain benchmark, which we've just produced of the largest food and beverage companies in the world, report an average score by those companies of 16 out of 100 for companies' diligence on workers' voice. So it's an extraordinarily low score for bringing in workers' voice. Yet Tesco, Unilever and Nestle score way, way higher than the rest. And this demonstrates really that it is a company choice not to listen to workers and therefore demonstrate that due diligence. The third point in the compendium is that the due diligence must go beyond a tick box exercise. And this is critical, I think, to the design. A fact to back this is that all the benchmarks that we deliver demonstrate a breach really opening up between policy commitments and their implementation on the ground. To give you just one of those, the worst some of the worst examples is in purchasing practices in supply chains. So, for instance, the Malaysian rubber glove manufacturer Top Glove supplies a third of the world's rubber gloves. Its factories were deemed compliant by over 100 social audits a year ago, before it took just days for investigative journalists to find endemic forced labour through debt bondage and recruitment fees in their factories. So that's why the tick box exercise, we've got the social audit compliance statement, tick, is just not going to work in this case. The fourth point is that regulation needs penalties to be effective and create a level playing field for more responsible companies. A fact to back this up is that the use of the US Tariff Act this year to impound Top Glove's imports at port. After years of prevarication, that's led to a commitment by Top Glove immediately to repay $12 million of recruitment fees back to their workers. And a competitor, Kassam Rubber, anticipating the same trouble perhaps, has announced it will pay $10 million also in recruitment fees. So you can see where that penalty really makes a difference to the behaviour of companies. And the final point is that the mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence is not a panacea, and it needs to work with other policies, such as perhaps a European equivalent of the US Tariff Act, which I know Lara Wolters and Heidi Hautala have also spoken about. But it's also the case that we've got the European Sustainable Finance Initiative and the Finance Taxonomy Initiatives, where those will work very much in agreement with the due diligence laws when they come through. You can find the compendium on the Resource Centre and the BMZ websites, and I think they've already been sent to you. So I'll move now straight to the first panel, Perspectives from the Global South. I'd like to welcome Dr. Rubana Hook, who's president of the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Exports Association, Fernanda Oppenheim, co-executive director of the Project on Organisation, Development and Education and Research, PODER, and chair of the board of the ESCRnet in Mexico, and Sharon Burrow, general secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. So the guiding question for this panel is, what should European decision makers do to improve working and living conditions along global supply chains? I'll move straight to you, if I may, Dr. Rubana Hook.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak here. COVID-19 has unleashed serious uncertainties in the lives of the workers and the industry, entrepreneurs as well. So, you know, the first and only ask from our end would be to collectively, centrally ensure that there is a collective accountability, not just in supply chain, but also in the sourcing companies. So it's a question of all of us being in it together. It's just not about one end doing it. So even if we talk about a central control or some guidelines, the first thing that occurred to us when COVID hit us was the complete collapse of a system where there was just no assurance of a worker's payment. So an unemployment fund scheme is what we are missing at this point. And here, Bangladesh pays almost $423 million worth wages every month to the workers. So it's just not a measly amount. With that in mind, there must be accountability woven in the sourcing practices, along with a practice that will also have a similar ask from our end. So it's not about just one end, it's all about the government, the industry, and of course, the brands being in it together. So collectively moving forward would be the best ask. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's an excellent description of the experience in Bangladesh. Could I ask you then just to amplify a little the issues that you see are necessary? What do you really would want from the European Union now in terms of this due diligence law to build what you described as that collective responsibility along the supply chain, to make sure that the brands that you're supplying, your members are supplying, really are able to pay the wages of workers in these extraordinarily disruptive moments?
Well, I can only say that, you know, in our country, we have a relationship with our government where we are 0.03% of our export proceeds are deducted and given to the government. So approximately $10 million are deposited with the government as a practice to bail out any factories in distress if required. If a similar imposition, not imposition, I should not be negative, but you know, if this could be woven into the relationship between the government and the brands in in EU, then that would help us. Because so far, all we hear about is us not complying. But we've actually never taken any corporate entity and made them accountable for their practices. It's always a case of force majeure. So, you know, a contract is just revoked overnight. Payments are just deferred over an email. This has to be stopped. As much as we understand the predicament of the sourcing partners, it's also true that at our end, it has a direct impact. So let us hope that, you know, through EU, some, if not binding, but at least, you know, compelling arguments and terms and conditions are put in place so that the business houses can also make their money, have their profits, not an issue with that, but also be accountable for doing good, feeling good, and looking good at the same time.
Very good, and thank you very much for that. That's very insightful in terms of the way those contracts have been used, and particularly the force majeure clauses that were used to really not even pay for the goods that had been produced. So it's very interesting. Are there ways, do you think, would you like to see those kind of clauses removed as part of a due diligence proposal in Europe?
Indeed. Thank you for asking all the leading and the probing questions. That gives me an opportunity to be direct. Yes, we would want the contracts to be more defined and not be unilateral. Because what happens is, out of the 100%, Bangladesh works only 44% against letters of credit. The rest is all under telegraphic transfer and loose contracts. And you know, business is an act of faith. So both parties commit to that act of faith, and we all engage. And business conditions are also harsh. So if some kind of a clause could be also inserted in the contracts of at least an alternative dispute resolution, where, you know, we and the buyers could be bound together, then that would help. Because often when a buyer declares a bankruptcy or insolvency in the West, it has no mirroring effect on us. So
Yeah.
we still have our back-to-back liabilities. We still have receivables from the buyer's end, and we are rendered helpless. So
Yes.
in this kind of a situation, if an ADR, an alternative dispute resolution clause can be inserted, which would be internationally recognizable, then that would help us also.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Rabanahuk, thank you very much. Really insightful comments there directly out from Bangladesh, which has experienced so much during this pandemic. I'd like to now move, if I may, to our second speaker, Fernanda Oppenheim. Fernanda, could you also just give us your opening statement on that first guiding question? Back to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here joining you and having the opportunity to sharing some thoughts on this important topic. Firstly, I'd like to stress the enormous potential that a EU-wide due diligence initiative to protect human rights has. I think that with the right provisions, such regulation could be key to promote the reform of corporate conduct and hopefully prevent environmental and social harm. I come from Mexico. Workers and communities from countries in the global south are really the ones that are taking the hardest impacts of irresponsible corporate behavior globally. And Latin America, for example, is the most dangerous region in the world for human rights defenders, particularly at the community level. So mandatory due diligence laws should not only incorporate prevention measures, but also include civil and criminal penalties when harm happens. As you were stating, Phil, this I think it's an agreement that we all have that this could prevent irresponsible behaviors. This would also have the potential to help end attacks, criminalization, intimidation, and threats against human rights defenders and communities, as we see it. Legal provisions must also apply to companies as well as investors and financial institutions across different commodities and sectors. And definitely for the EU legislation to be effective, it must include norms and requirements that are fully aligned with international rights, human rights law and standards. And this also relates to, land and territorial rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And in that respect, I think these provisions should require respect for free, prior, and informed consent in line with all international instruments, and that companies should be required by law to conduct independent human rights and environmental impact assessments that are participatory by definition. So I think that in this context that we're living in with the COVID pandemic, but also the climate crisis and all of the harmful consequences that we've seen from different investment projects and company operations taking strong steps towards human rights obligations, it's more urgent than ever before. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was really insightful, again, from a position in Latin America. Could I, you've really focused, I think, some of your remarks on more vulnerable sections, particularly obviously indigenous people, and also on human rights defenders, those who are speaking out, who are often finding that their voices are silenced through intimidation, threat, or attack. Could I ask you to just say a little more about how you think a human rights due diligence law in Europe could reach out into those supply chains where those human rights defenders or those indigenous communities are and make a difference to their lives? That the issue of dignity that was raised right at the start by Mr. Norbert Bartler, for instance.
Sure. I think that, again, the potential could be very big as long as double standards are avoided. So I think that assuming the extraterritorial obligations and demanding the same behavior from European companies, not only within Europe, but abroad, could definitely help have better tools to prevent harm. And to, as long as we change corporate behavior, I think there's a lot more potential for protecting human rights defenders and protecting the most vulnerable communities and workers. And I should also stress that incorporating a gender perspective is very important to this kind of instruments, as women and girls are sometimes the most vulnerable in many of the sectors, both as workers, but also as community members. So I think in that sense, combining, the standards that are developed and the regulations developed in Europe with international law, with other spaces where mandatory instruments are being developed, such as the UN and discussions around the binding treaty, could provide us with different tools to defend the right to defend human rights.
And just very briefly before we finish, Fernanda, that relationship between what the European Union is developing here in terms of mandatory human rights due diligence and the binding treaty, which I know you're also involved in. Do you see any relationship there? Do you see a mutual reinforcement, or is the conflict between the two concepts?
I think there's a lot of potential for complementarity. I think that due diligence, it's part of the discussions, at the binding treaty level. So there's no clash there. On the contrary, I think that this could be very complementary processes, as well as, all the processes related to the UNGPs that have been, developed in the last 10 years. There's definitely a big importance in the participation of the European Union in the binding treaty, I think, and a call, maybe, if I may take that freedom, for them to continue to participate, because I think that we need to move in different directions towards the same goal of protecting human rights and changing the model of doing business.
Thanks very much. That's very clear, and I think we'll definitely allow you that liberty. May I now move straight to Sharon? Sharon, lovely to see you again, and thanks ever so much for being with us on this panel. Would you like to make your first statement on that opening guiding question?
Thank you, Phil. And indeed, I want to thank the Commissioner. The world does need a new business model. Indeed, we need a new social contract that it would indeed usher in. But I really want to say thank you to the EU, because you have put yourself now at the centre of what is an urgent and vital debate. It's not just that our social contract is broken, it's the elements of that. And you heard from Urbana, and you heard the risks that human and labour rights, environmental rights defenders face. Indeed, Phil, in many of our countries, particularly in Latin America, they actually face death as well, because they still shoot trade unionists for demanding fundamental rights. But in a big picture, if you take our supply chains, 94% of the workforce is a hidden workforce. The model has simply allowed obscurity and therefore a lack of responsibility. And indeed, my appreciation for the German government goes back many years, because it was indeed Chancellor Merkel who put the issue of rights and supply chains on the agenda of the G7. And then with the then Labour Minister Nahles, the G20. And now you see the EU with the German government and others actually looking not just at domestic law, but committing to a universal or a unity of a standard at the EU. This will change the face of the way global trade is actually conducted. And so we are on the team to actually see indeed mandated due diligence achieved. If I told you, and you know it well, Phil and others, but the model we have, the business model we now have, has indeed a disintegrating global workforce. It's not good for anybody. It's not good for a global economy. It's not good for working families, and it's certainly not good for a stable global future. And that is that 60% of the workers are now informal. They have no rights, no minimum wage, no rule of law, no social protection. Actually includes many of our new and emerging platform businesses. You can find much of this informality now in our global supply chains. And even in the formal sector, informal work is about a third or more of that workforce, really precarious work. Having walked those supply chains and having worked with Urbana and other employers in the industry, in the global south, or in these industry sectors, then I would say to you, this is beyond time. It's urgent. We have the tools. The UN guiding principles are 20 years old. Indeed, they provided a game changer. And now we need to make sure, and the last 10 years, I should say, of the debates in that environment are now urgent. I also reiterate we need the EU on the negotiating team with a mandate in the treaty, and I'm hoping this will provide it. But the OECD showed us the way. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Governments, employers, unions, supporting governments have actually agreed to the ILO guidelines. The due diligence general guidance and some sectoral guidance is there. And we simply have to enact a directive or the rule of law everywhere to make this possible. So how will it change the scenario? I just welcomed that question you asked just a while ago. If the EU market, with its 450 million consumers, represents more than a fifth of global GDP, and if that's conditional upon complying with certain legal requirements, then you change the face of global trade within the EU, and if you want to trade in and outside the EU. And can I say, finally, we do need compliance, absolutely, because otherwise this will just be more volunteerism. But the first order for us is to see that the due diligence is done, the risk analysis of rights and environmental standards, we would hope. And then grievance procedures are put in place where we and others can work with the companies to effect remedy. If that's not done, then of course compliance and indeed the access to other legal remedies should still be possible. But in the first instance, it's about a solid framework of expectation backed by compliance and the tools to make it possible. I can only say thank you. It's good for workers, yes, but it's also good for business, because when you have a fair competition flaw that this actually outlines, then the companies that want to actually behave ethically have got an equal opportunity with others who don't.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Again, a great exposition about some of the key aspects that you want to see there. Could I just take you back just for a moment for the audience, perhaps, just to say a little bit more about what you see as the new social contract and how the human rights due diligence law will reinforce that shift that you see as vital for the long-term security of global markets, national markets, and the dignity of workers and communities.
Thanks, Phil. So the reason I laboured the disintegrating labour market is that we can't hope to build a just model of development or to give workers security if we don't actually change the rules. The ILO Centenary Declaration, negotiated by business, employers, and business, labour, and governments just last year, actually laid the framework. If you put a floor of rights, a labour protection floor, a universal labour guarantee, whatever you want to call it, that's outlined in that declaration under all workers, irrespective of the employment relationship. We can fight about that, and we should. But if all workers have a floor of fundamental rights, of occupational health and safety, of a minimum wage on which they can live with dignity, and of course the collective bargaining rights in the fundamental rights with freedom of association and maximum hours of work, then they start to have some capacity to build decent work. And then if you marry that with universal social protection and a transformative agenda for women, and indeed the just transitions for climate and technology, where social dialogue is at the core of this, then you have a very different world. That's the challenge. Yeah. Can we do it? And when you ask workers what they want a job. That's critical now in recovery. They want universal social protection, and they want to know that their rights are protected. It's that simple.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to go back, if I may, just for a moment to Fernanda and Rubana. Fernanda, could I just ask you to say, what you see as the opportunities in Mexico? Is there a debate at all on the mandatory human rights due diligence in Mexico? And are there ways in which Europe and Mexico might be able to collaborate on expanding this expanding geographically this initiative? Just in a minute, if you would.
Sure, I'll be very quick. So there's a proposal for a law that has been developed by one congressman, and I think we've just had very recently the opportunity to read it, and it's still quite limited. So it's good that it's on the table. It's good that the discussion is starting to happen, but there's still a long way to go, and the quality of the proposal, I would say, it's very limited, if I may. So I think that in terms of the relationship between the EU and Mexico and the rest of Latin America, I mean, Mexico, if it has the political will, it could be one of the champions in the region to push this forward, as long as, again, these processes are participatory and open for input from different stakeholders and so on and so forth. And I think the relationship between the EU and Mexico, also the commercial and political relationships, bring a lot of potential to having a collaboration in that sense and to moving the agenda together.
Thank you, Fernanda. There's some hope in what you've just said there, so that's good news. Dr. Urbana-Hook, could I just come back to you for a final comment, please? Just perhaps I heard a lot of agreement in a number of areas between yourself and Sharon. I wonder if you might want to say a little bit more about how you see, the issues of social contract in Bangladesh and social protection, which you were also emphasizing in what you were saying. Do you see synergies with some of the issues that Sharon was raising as well?
Yes. Yes, I see absolute synergies in most of what Sharon was saying, because Sharon has an intense experience of working in Bangladesh, with Bangladesh actually, and in most of the issues. But one thing good about us is that, at least with ready-made garment industry, it's formalized. Apart from ready-made garment industry, there are other industries where it's really informal. So that informal engagement has to be formalized at some point, because there's a huge, there are a lot of who actually don't fall under the formal economy. So that needs to be figured out, actually. But in terms of human rights, I can only say that, there was a recent statistics yesterday, which clearly indicates, the number of trade unions in Bangladesh has gone up from 64% in 2014. It's up to 86% in 2020. So that is at least some kind of a good indication. It does not mean that we have done all that we could do. It just means that the journey has begun. And, these are times when you realize that the reforms must come from within. And it cannot be a prescription. It has to be from our own end. It has to be with clear guidance and support of friends who understand the whole situation. I have requested Sharon to introduce and engage with us in alternative dispute resolution, so that we improve our industrial relation with our workers. And she, I hope, is working on that format. And as soon as I have a proposal, we'll be doing better. One thing I wanted to stress, and I missed out on my opening remark, was
just briefly, thank you.
Just the concept of sustainability, if that could be taken into consideration. Because sustainability so far means only environmental sustainability, and understand sustainable lives and livelihoods, the sync between sustainable sourcing, sustainable supply, linking to sustainable lives and livelihoods, that must be redefined. So there must be some kind of a way to insert that in the EU discourse. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was also, I think, really critical final point, that sustainability is very much environmental, but more than environmental as well. And the issue of livelihoods is fundamental to it. And I think anybody who knows the performance of ESG funds, the environmental, social and governance funds, over the last year in particular, and over the last 3 years even, outperforming so much that's not ESG focused, is an endorsement of what you've just said, Dr. Urbana-Hook. So thanks very much. I'd like to thank the panel very much for your contributions today. We're going to move, if I may, abruptly and straightforwardly over to the second panel, as we have just another 35 minutes to also deal with that. But thanks ever so much for your kind contributions. So the second panel is very much focused on the perspectives from the global north. So I'd like to welcome now Christian Ewert, who's president of Amphora in Belgium, Sebastian Körpel, who's managing partner at Becker's Beste, Germany, Dr. Antje van Dewitz, who is chief executive officer of Wouter, the sports company, and Theo Jekyll, who's legal counsel at the Business and Human Rights expert at Ericsson from Sweden. So thanks very much to all of you for being with us today. The guiding question for the panel in terms of your first contribution is what should European companies do to improve working and living conditions along global supply and value chains and its relationship to the mandatory human rights due diligence. So I'd like to start, if I may, with Christian. Could I come straight to you, please?
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Phil. And allow me to mention our sincere appreciation to the German presidency and the organizers for putting this great event together and giving us the opportunity to join you here today. Well, Amphora represents about 2,400 countries, 21 different industry sectors, food and non-food, sourcing from all parts of the world. And our mission is to support businesses in their efforts to improve the social and environmental conditions in their supply chains, so really the whole sustainability definition. More specifically, this means that we provide a comprehensive range of services and tools for what we call continuous improvement centered around international normative frameworks like the UNGPs or the OECD guidance for responsible business conduct. Why the UNGPs and the OECD guidance? Because they have been instrumental in laying the foundation for an agreed standard of conduct for business, which is in principle what we call due diligence. It is fair to say that our member companies have significantly shaped the principle of voluntary self-commitment in Europe for the last 15 years. And by embracing with what we call the Amphora BCI principles and values, our members A, commit to investing and building capacity in company supply chains, B, commit to working with their business partners to improve and enhance workers' conditions, and thirdly, they put in place corrective actions when needed and to drive continuous improvement. This is where our members can and have been playing a really important role. And we are proud of what has been accomplished to date, but certainly at the same time, we are well aware there is much more to be done. What is really missing is scale. And scale will not happen with piecemeal company by company efforts. And smart and effective legislation therefore comes into play, since it helps suppliers to progressively improve and gradually pave the way for a deeper conversation in supply chains. It is why initiatives like the one of the, let's say in the pipeline by the European Union for the adoption of a harmonized due diligence legislation, have the potential to be truly transformational. They can bring cohesion to scattered efforts and level the playing field. Amphora is very supportive of this process, and in fact, we have actually been the first business association to openly support action at EU level for the adoption of a comprehensive approach to due diligence, including legislation. At the same time, we should not forget that we live and operate in a world economy based on very complex global supply chains. And this is why it's important to be pragmatic and to acknowledge that human rights due diligence is a journey. The question for us then is, how to design legislation in a way that companies have the confidence to openly share the challenges they encounter instead of pulling out from problematic contexts in fear of reputational damage or retaliation. And legislation should create the conditions for business partners to work together and to see the conducting of due diligence more as a joint responsibility. And this is what ultimately will transform supply chains for the better. And on a final note, please, the EU should not reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good work that has been accomplished by voluntary schemes and programs often driven by industry. And those should be promoted and incentivized. Let's not forget that voluntary schemes paved the way for business action to address supply chain challenges before legislation did. And we see ourselves as a partner and are willing to certainly constructively engage in this, as we have done for the time being, to really drive systemic change in global supply chain. Thanks. Over to you.
Thanks very much. And again, I really enjoy your emphasis on that issue of the way voluntary action can also build and support the regulatory action, the way in which that leadership that's demonstrated by companies, that by leading companies, can reinforce the need for a level playing field. Can I just perhaps come back to you on that and just say, could you say a little bit more about how you as Amfori have seen that dynamic of a level playing field and the way in which you think a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislative initiative can reinforce that level playing field for European companies, and particularly for the more responsible companies in the internal market?
Well, we believe a key cornerstone of due diligence is the philosophy of continuous improvement. I mentioned that already briefly. The idea of ESG due diligence does not have to be perfect from the start, and that it rather is a step-by-step approach. Legislation, however, should capture this dimension and cater for the fact that companies are at different maturity levels when it comes to due diligence. And also, we believe that legislation, in order to be successful, needs to literally acknowledge the very fact of conducting due diligence will most probably result in companies identifying risks and challenges in their supply chains while going through the process. And maybe one more comment in this, let's say a smart mix of measures here, and really the combination of voluntary and mandatory elements here. And, you know, from our point of view, one element I would like to kick in is, I mean, let's say governments in the European institutions in itself have a business conduct responsibility. I mean, through just one example, the member states' public procurement policies. And I believe a lot could be accomplished at this, especially when I look at that that there is already legislation in place by the European Union.
Yeah. That's great, and thanks very much. And I know that'll be something that other speakers on the panel will, I'm sure, want to pick up, that joint responsibility in the way public procurement can be such an important incentive to businesses. So thanks very much, Christian. I'll now move, if I may, to Sebastian Körpel. If you could also just give us your perspective. This is an important one, I think, because your Becker's Beste is a small and medium-sized enterprise, which we know is of significant concern in terms of this law not squashing small and medium-sized enterprises and yet also lifting the standards. So I know your company's been a leader in this. Can I turn to you, please?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. It's my first time to speak to such an audience, and to be honest, I've never done it before in English. But this topic is too important for me, and so I'm really happy about this chance. Just a short introduction to me and my company. I have the honor to lead a company my great-grandmother founded in 1932. We are a producer of high-quality ambient fruit juices, more than 40% in organic quality. Since 2015, we are climate neutral. At the center of our actions is our appreciation for people and nature. Let me express that I'm basically not a fan of governmental regulations. Whenever possible, it should be regulated by free market. But in case of social and ecologic sustainability, the market fails. In my point of view, we have a social problem. The key question is how we want to consume and live in future. How do we define prosperity? Are there alternatives to ongoing economic growth? Growth means that somebody has to suffer for it. If not within the system, nature and the people in the supply chain will suffer. Our social and economic systems ensure that in the food business, The retailers are permanently increasing the price pressure on the food industry, with consequences for the global supply chain. But for sure, this view is far too short-sighted. To solve these problems, we would need a broad social dialogue between consumers, media, retailers, industry, and politics. But time is running out for our nature and for the people. Both suffer far too long. In the juice sector, orange juice is for sure one of the most sensitive products. Here we have to face a strong concentration of 3 suppliers who dominate the market and the working conditions in Brazil. In my belief, there are 2 possibilities to face the problem from industry side. For us as a small or medium-sized company, it's nearly impossible to face the challenge on our own. No grower or processor will change his behavior for us. But living from agricultural products, we want to bear our responsibility. What we can do is to establish multi-stakeholder initiatives to develop profitable pilot plantations with fair working conditions. This is what we are currently doing in cooperation with the BMZ, 2 German retailers, the German and Brazilian trade unions, and other partners. Our goal is to show best practices and to start a social dialogue. I tell you, the small and medium companies are not the problem. Most of us are driven by values, not by stock prices. But these initiatives are not enough. Much more important is to force global corporations to use their negotiation power to convince the global raw material suppliers to change their behavior. If they do so, we will have a level playing field. We just made those experiences, but still it's luck to find these. That's why we need, for example, the German Lieferkettengesetz or binding corporate due diligence measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, Sebastian, to get that perspective directly from yourself. And thanks ever so much for coming on and giving us that perspective. It just one, I think, crucial point that I'd like to just come back to you on is that issue of the way in which the global corporations, with their emphasis often on short-term return on investment, because that's what investors demand, and yet the opportunity now that you see of mandatory human rights due diligence actually supporting and keep opening a space for small and medium-sized enterprises by lessening the pressure down the supply chain from those purchasers. Could you say a little bit more about just a few more comments about how you see, as a small and medium-sized enterprise, that those due diligence legislation might help relieve that pressure?
Yeah, we made those experiences, for example, with coconut water. We were searching for suppliers who could supply us in a quality on social standards and sustainable standards that we wanted to have. But we were only lucky to find a supplier whose biggest supplier was a big international corporation who forced them to accept better working conditions and sustainable things. So it was luck for us to find such a supplier who was forced by another one or convinced by another one to do so. But our demand is far too small to convince them.
Great. Listen, that's I couldn't ask for a better example. And that's the kind of thing that I think the due diligence legislation could really support and help in terms of universalizing that experience. Yeah. So thanks ever so much for that. I'll now move, if I may, to our third speaker in this panel, Dr. Antje von Dewitz. Would you like to just first of all respond to that guiding question?
Hi there, I'm Antje von Dewitz. I'm the CEO of VD Sport. We are an outdoor equipper in the textile industry. And also we, with 100 million turnover, are a middle-sized company within this international competitive textile market of the outer industry. And when I overtook the company in 2009, we swore to ourselves we will do everything to transform this company into a fair and ecological company. And we did 12 years now of transformation of our supply chains according to the highest eco and social standards. Even though we're rather a middle to small size in the international outdoor market, we also at that point 12 years ago, where we only had a turnover of 50 million euro, have a high level of complexity in our supply chains. So we dealt with 65 predominantly Asian producers and over 150 material suppliers, and had the goal to transform everything. So we built up new expertise for sustainability, for chemicals, for energy, for standards of working conditions and supply chains. We introduced CR management systems of all kinds at our company. We hired people here in Asia for these topics. We have ourselves since that time and our partners externally audited, like from Fairware, from GOTS and so on. We nominate all our materials according to the highest textile standards. We do extensive research for new environmentally friendly textile solutions. And we created a label to document our effort. It's called Green Shape. And you all know the green button because it was introduced today. Almost more than 90% of our entire collection is already in green button. So why legislation necessary if it's already possible for an SME? Everything that I told you right now causes immense costs and efforts. It was a journey to hell to get there. It was a great deal of effort to persuade our producers and material suppliers to follow that way, especially, like you just told, Sebastian, with little negotiation power as an SME. Many refused to go this way with us. They said we had to look for new ones. Or many of them said, yes, I will do this audit for you, the certification, whatever, but you pay. Adding to that, we have the risk, we always had the risk, especially in the beginning, that the consumer will not appreciate this effort as an added value and will not be prepared to pay the extra cost. So from the point of today, taking on responsibility like we do is a competitive disadvantage. So a binding legislative would have following advantages. And we feel this because more and more companies are adding to this. So we already feel some consequences. You can share costs with more brands for audits, for example, because you share the same production sites. You can share costs and efforts for tracking the findings from the audits. You can share costs, for example, for joint wastewater samples in ecological terms. And you can do joint research. You can create with a legal binding, you can create more demands for audits and certifications. So you don't have to go and look and persuade. You have a much quicker transformation of the supply chain. And in terms of the end consumer, you would so much help to develop a feeling for true costs. So far, it is very difficult for consumers to understand why a garment with the same appearance should cost so differently. So. And last but not least, you already mentioned it, you would create a level playing field. Companies that avoid responsibility should no longer have a competitive advantage because of lower costs and efforts. And last but not least, what I expect very much from a binding legislative is an innovation push for sustainable research. For example, for the replacement for solutions for harmful substances. If the entire supply chain concentrates on these topics, you find so much quicker solutions. I experienced it so often in the past, for example, when Greenpeace made a big campaign on one topic, a few years later, suddenly there were solutions because everybody concentrated on. So what I wish for is a binding legislative on minimum standards in ecological and social areas. It must be applicable to marketing participants who place products to Europe or to Germany in order that not only the Germans and Europeans, but all, because the European outdoor market is an international market. So American products should also accord to these legislatives if they sell their products here. And as has been mentioned before, don't invent the new wheel. Please implement based on existing good and high industry standards. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Antti. I think we can all feel the energy that you brought to this extraordinary effort since 2009. So it's remarkable experience to hear this, and also to hear just the scale and breadth of the advantages that you see as a medium-sized enterprise from a mandatory human rights due diligence, an environmental due diligence approach. Just as a follow-up question, briefly, could I ask you just how can businesses be incentivized and supported to actively engage in complying with human rights, social and environmental standards? Do you see additional measures perhaps that can accompany a regulation on corporate due diligence as a flanking measure?
Yes, accompanying measures should be on political level through interactions with the countries, if possible, to adapt the legal framework locally. So that would be good. We are always in need, and we always use them, empowerment programs in the production countries, so we can offer also something. We always start empowerment programs with our production side, and as more help comes financially, the better we get forwards. For example, for trainings, for renewable energy programs, for development of management systems in the development countries, but in the production sites or in the material productions. And last but not least, I would see also, when I talk to other business leaders, I see they have a fear to start because they don't know how. So I would also see empowerment programs in Europe for European companies to get them started, to take away the fear from them for the first steps. So these would be very good.
Thank you very much. And there would be, I think, very exciting flanking measures for us all to consider in terms of the consultation that Didier Reinders spoke about in terms of the things that we need to contribute there. Thanks very much, Antje. I'll now move to our last panelist, Theo Jekyll, who's the legal counsel and business and human rights expert at Ericsson. Theo, could you start, please, by just answering that first guiding question about what you see companies can do in this area?
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for inviting us to speak, and thank you to the German presidency for organizing. I hope you can hear me, or...
It's a little faint. If you could move your microphone perhaps even closer to your mouth.
Okay, sorry about that.
Much better, much better.
Much better? Okay, thank you. Just first of all, I would like to state that Ericsson has previously publicly stated that we support the need for mandatory human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence as well. And of course, for the reasons that have already been identified here. So a level playing field, harmonization, fair competition, and legal certainty. I also want to echo the need, of course, to build these new requirements on existing frameworks, such as the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines. But I also want to stress there that we need to fully then understand what these frameworks actually mean. So not start picking and choosing parts of these frameworks to translate into legal requirements, but really embrace the full scope of what the frameworks mean. So, for example, from a UN Guiding Principles perspective, that means that stakeholder consultation is, of course, part of any proper human rights due diligence. That also means assuming responsibility for remedy in case of impacts that have been caused. That also means having a full value chain approach to risks. So I think we really need to understand what it will mean in practice to translate these existing frameworks into a legislative proposal. More on the challenges perspective, just to give you an example from our end, I mean, we are a big multinational company. We have over 20,000 suppliers. We are operating in 180 countries. But we also have challenges when it comes to ensuring that these requirements are implemented across our value chain. We see a clear difference when we talk to our business partners, when we refer to legal requirements such as trade compliance law, anti-bribery legislation, and so on. There is an understanding why we need to push these requirements because we have legal requirements as a company. While on the other hand, when we discuss in some cases in more high-risk markets where the understanding for human rights issues is not at the same level, as for us, there is more pushback on when we refer to soft law instruments or our own policies and procedures. So as has been stated before, having these clear requirements makes it much easier for us to raise the issues in dialogues with business partners and ensure that the issues are embedded throughout the value chain. And that's the only way that we will reach this goal, to have better outcomes for people and really have this implemented across the value chain. Just a few last points on some key issues and recommendations for moving forward with this. As I said, a full value chain approach and a risk-based approach is, I think, very important. I've seen with a little bit concern some proposals or discussions around this to kind of limit it to a specific number of tiers in a supply chain, for example. I think that is not the right way to go, because risks materialize very differently for companies. So for us, for example, the human rights risks are very different when it comes to our customer relationships and our supplier relationships, and of course different in different stages of the supply chain. So we have to have this risk-based approach, not a supply chain tier approach. Also, just to close, that to understand that due diligence is so much more than just auditing. Often we come back to just, okay, what can companies do? We can audit where we have a business relationship and we can report on progress. But due diligence is so much more, and that needs to also be reflected in this legislation, as was mentioned before here, to incentivize companies to really use due diligence measures, not as only a compliance exercise to protect the company from legal risk, but also to ensure, again, better outcomes for people. So that flexibility based on the company's own operations and the severity of the risks need to be reflected as well. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's really helpful. Deo, I'm going to ask you just one final question. We've got 3 minutes left. I'm sorry, I know we've got a few more minutes, so I will perhaps be able to go back to others. But just very briefly, if I may, on that issue of, I think this is a critical point that you raise around due diligence being more than auditing. It's that element that came out very strongly in the compendium about this moving beyond the tick box exercise to due diligence. And of course, I raised as well this issue of the way in which compliance statements from social audits often don't reflect the reality on the ground because of conflicts of interest in that system. Could you just, in literally a minute or a minute and a half, give us just an overview about the way Ericsson approaches that due diligence work in terms of, identifying the salient risks and then being able to develop risk reduction models, not just for the company, but as you rightly say, for the workers and communities that are perhaps affected?
Of course. So very briefly, going back to my first point, to be able to identify the salient risks and to prioritize actions accordingly, again, stakeholder consultation and engagement is key for us. We would not have reached the conclusions and also identify proper actions without stakeholder engagement. So I think, again, that is a key issue to build into any further legislative measures as well. And then how we approach this, we of course conduct audits, but we've also realized over time that that's just one piece of the puzzle. And especially on the more complex systemic issues in our value chain, we are now moving more into collaborations with other business partners, both customers and suppliers. And having, again, this clear legal requirement will enable those collaborations, because then we have a common understanding of what is actually required of us and how we can share responsibility.
Right. Yeah, that's great. So we've got literally 5 minutes left. I want to just use that 5 minutes, if I may, to ask each of you just to give us literally 1 minute, and I'll have to be strict, just to say a few words about what you see as the issues around liability. I think for companies, this is something that's of concern. So let me just go through and ask you very briefly to say where you see the opportunities for this level playing field being established and the way in which that liability issue needs to be dealt with by the Commission. Theo, could I go back to you, because I know you've thought about this more deeply than perhaps many of us.
Sure. Just to start, we of course acknowledge that liability provisions need to be included in any legislation to make sure that the requirements are effective. Of course, liability needs to be clear and predictable for companies. So here, I mean, what we suggest is again to build on concepts from the UN guiding principles to ensure, for example, that companies already have committed where we cause or contribute to impacts that we also are responsible for remedy. And that could be something to maybe use in the legislation as well to build liability provisions on that concept. So just to close, I would say that in, again, building these liability provisions, I think, again, we have to keep in mind the two perspectives here. They need to work as an effective deterrent for companies, but also a way to provide remedy for stakeholders. So again, it's not just the compliance issue, but also creating that avenue for remedy for affected stakeholders. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's a very clear, brief exposition. So thank you. Antje, could I come to you next? We'll go in reverse order. Hello. I think you're on mute. Is the mute button not?
Sorry about that. Sorry
no
about
problem.
That.
We've all been there, Antje.
Of course, if the question is, do we need liability? Yes, we do. Otherwise, you can just leave out the law. Without liability, there's no coming forward, no moving forward. Yeah. And just as Theo had said, it has to be. We have to plan it, we have to rely on, it has to be transparent for us how we are reliable. And I think that existing systems like, for example, if you know the Fairware system, where you have, where you prove that you report, that you have a risk management, that you analyze your risk, that you have a management system in work, that you have responsibilities and processes, where you have a compliance system, and you prove to follow up on everything that comes up, then you have done a good job. If not, then not. So it has to be plannable how you are reliable. But we definitely need liability.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Very clear again exposition. Could I, Sebastian? Could I come to you next, and then I'll come for a final word to you, Christian. Sebastian.
Yeah, for sure we need liabilities. But to be honest, I can't tell you much about it, because I wouldn't be an entrepreneur if I cared for liability. We try to do a good job. We are value driven, as I said before. So we want to be a step further, and we don't look back to care for our liabilities. But if you want to change something, there must be an effect for those people who don't want to change.
Thank you. Very clear again. So finally, if I may, I'll just go to Christian for a final remark, and then we'll move back to you, Christine.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think what is important, that legislation should kind of create the right incentives for business partners to see the conducting of due diligence as a joint responsibility, as I said. And this should really be an element to transform supply chains to be better. I furthermore think it's essential that legislation also does not generate unintended consequences. And we have seen this, or we are, in certain instances, to disengage from certain regions, avoiding certain risks at all costs, certainly would also be very counterproductive. We are completely in agreement that legislation should not turn into a box-ticking exercise, absolutely, because that would be counterproductive in this context. I would just like to remember what John Ruggie said in December when he was in Brussels with us, that the element of liability needs to be carried forward in a pragmatic fashion. And I think we have to be careful with overemphasizing civil liability that is being mentioned in this context. I leave it at that, Phil.
Thank you very much. So I think we've heard very much echoing what was said by our first opening speakers. Prevention is better than cure. We need the new business model. This is about creating dignity both at work and for communities that are working with businesses, that we need that social protection, the increased sustainability, both environmental and social, and building resilience, particularly in the context of the pandemic. We've heard very clearly, I think, strong arguments for level playing field, harmonisation of standards and legal certainty. And I think finally we've heard that liability has to play a fundamental role here. It needs to be clear and predictable, and it needs to be an effective deterrent, as well as allowing access to remedy and access to justice. So thanks very much to all the speakers. We've raced through this. You've all been extraordinarily disciplined, and I'll pass straight over to you, Kristin, for the next section.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you very much to all the panelists for, I think, this very substantial discussion, and also for an excellent time management. By the way, if you would like to discuss the event on Twitter, you may use the following hashtag #BMZForumBHR in one word. I repeat it again, #BMZForumBHR, in case you would like to discuss it on Twitter. Well, we have heard a lot of very excellent recommendations and a lot of food for thought. And now we turn again to the political decision makers, asking them what they think should be amended and improved. What are the policy options for a mandatory due diligence regulation? But first, I would like to heartily welcome Johanna Sumuvuori, who is the Finnish State Secretary of the Finnish Foreign Minister. She will introduce the next session with a keynote input. State Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and greetings to everyone from Helsinki, and good afternoon. And I think it's a pleasure to participate to this very timely and topical event. And I would like to first of all congratulate Germany for all the great work during your EU presidency on this, and best of luck for the remaining few weeks as well. And I think this is a great platform to share views and continue where we left in the last discussions. And I actually participate myself to the Brussels meeting in December last year. It's amazing how quickly time has passed, because it feels like it was just yesterday. But I think this discussion has been moving on all the time, and we all have been contributing to it. And I'm very happy that the private sector has been so much involved with this in this agenda as well. Well, our own memories of our Finnish EU presidency are still quite fresh, and just about a year ago, it was the busiest time for us as we prepared for our Business and Human Rights Conference in Brussels. And there we launched an agenda for action, calling for a move for a more coherent and strategic direction for the European Union. And things have moved pretty fast since then. Already last February, the Commission published its study on due diligence and has now opened the formal consultation process on the legislative initiative on sustainable corporate governance. And my task today is to set the scene for the next panel, which will discuss in more detail what the concrete options for mandatory due diligence regulations are. And currently, there are a number of existing and new due diligence regulatory initiatives ongoing at national, regional, and global level. And these are all connected, and it's important to keep these interlinkages constantly in mind. In Finland, under our current government program, we have recently finalized and published a study exploring the possibilities for national mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. And the study actually has set light on a number of details that would need to be addressed as part of any legislative process. And many of those issues are also relevant when we discuss potential EU-level measures. The study was open for public consultation, and we received a lot of feedback from different stakeholders. Political decisions on the next steps will follow soon, and what will happen at the EU level is, of course, one factor influencing our own decision-making nationally. And we have also started our internal preparatory work on the new EU regulatory measures on due diligence. And we have already shared views on different stakeholders as we prepare our response to the Commission consultation. And it's important to avoid a patchwork of different national measures through EU initiatives that secure the same rules for the companies situated or operating in the single market. On our part, we have taken a positive stand towards a possible EU regulation already in our government program of last year. And it is essential that any new measures should be firmly based on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which we have unanimously endorsed at the UN Human Rights Council. Then another question is if there is a need to create a new legally binding instrument on due diligence, also at the global level. At the end of the day, the problems we are facing are of global nature and cannot be resolved by regulating only EU-based companies. However, the UN treaty process is not attracting enough member states to the negotiation table at the moment, and the current draft text does not seem to provide a basis for a legally sound and enforceable instrument that is capable to meet all the overall objectives of enhancing the level of protection for victims and ensuring a level playing field for companies. Also, the discussions at the International Labour Organization, ILO, have stalled as the views of the parties are far apart. In the meantime, we should now concentrate on what we can do at the EU level. Let me now highlight a few key issues that are central in the discussions about the options for effective due diligence regulation. First of all, I think we should keep in mind that we are striving for something that needs to have a real and positive impact on working and living conditions along the global value chains. Any due diligence measures should be aimed at improving human rights outcomes and be developed in consultation with the participation of all key stakeholders. At the same time, there is a need to enhance the predictability and legal certainty for business. It is important that we will clearly define what actions and processes are required from companies. However, we should also have enough flexibility so that the rules will function for different companies operating in different sectors. I believe a horizontal approach that covers all sectors is preferable to a sector-specific approach. It is important that we will take into account the different sizes of enterprises too. We should carefully assess how to treat small and medium-sized enterprises given their more limited resources, and some flexibilities are most probably needed here. And finally, a key issue in the debate will be the liabilities and possible sanctions. Before I conclude, I would like to return to the need for a broader agenda for action, the famous smart mix of voluntary and mandatory measures. Legislation alone cannot solve all the problems relating to unethical business. For example, we will need to support developing countries in their efforts to implement human and labor rights agreements. The work of human rights defenders will continue being as important as ever, and companies will also require further guidance and capacity building. I think we need an action plan that will put these things together at an EU level. This is something that many member states, including Finland and now Germany as the acting presidency of the Council, has called for. Without further ado, I thank you for having the possibility to share our views and ambitions on this topic, and wish you a very interesting and productive discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, State Secretary. I know that you created a lot of ground during your presidency a year ago. I already followed the discussion at that time too. Well, I think your speech was an excellent starting point for the next panel, which consists of various European politicians who will discuss how to improve working conditions along global supply and value chains. It is also my pleasure to introduce to you Christine Kaufmann. She's a professor of international, constitutional and administrative law at the University of Zurich. She has extensive experience in the field of responsible business conduct, and currently she chairs the OECD Working Party on responsible business conduct. Christine will facilitate the next panel and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Christine, for your introduction, and also many thanks to the German presidency for convening this very important forum today. I have to say that the introduction that we just heard from State Secretary Sumuwori could not have been better for our panel in just paving the ground and laying the ground for what we're going to discuss. I've been at many meetings over the last few weeks discussing due diligence legislation, and Dante Pesce, one of our speakers, already mentioned it feels a bit like a family reunion. And it was interesting to see that throughout all these meetings, wherever they took place, be it at the UN Forum, be it at the OECD or at the national level, there was a consensus among all stakeholders. And the consensus was that we need stronger government commitment when it comes to responsible business conduct. We have been focusing on business so far this morning, and we're now going to have a closer look on what the role of governments in that discussion is. So the big question really is, what brings such commitment to life? And we heard already in several of the discussions this morning that clear and operational enforceable due diligence regulations are key. Business needs to know what to expect, and we need to focus on the outcome. So what we essentially want to achieve is better working and living conditions on the ground. And clearly in that context, mandatory due diligence requirements, rules will play an important role, but equally important, I think, are, and it was mentioned towards the end in the second panel, are grievance mechanism, remedies, making sure that victims get a remedy if they are affected by business operations. And remedies, of course, can take non-judicial forms as the OECD national contact points, or they can take to the judicial remedy. And this is when we really need to talk about legal liability. But when we talk about due diligence, I think it's also important to remember that due diligence is a means to an end. It is not an end by itself. It is a means by an end, and the end is fairly clear, the goal that we want to achieve. I said it before, and Commissioner Reinders mentioned it in his speech, and also State Secretary at the very beginning. We talk about dignity. We talk about ensuring dignity for workers, for local communities, for people on the ground, and we talk also about taking care of our planet. And one instrument to achieve that is really, and what we need to achieve in this, is a new global business model. So having said that, I think momentum is increasing for discussing due diligence legislation. We have heard already, I don't need to repeat that the COVID-19 crisis highlighted the vulnerabilities of global value chains in a very dramatic way. But what it also highlighted, and recent OECD research confirms that, is that taking a responsible business conduct approach based on internationally agreed standards, such as the UNGP, such as the OECD guidelines, such as the ILO declarations, actually help business to build more resilient supply chains, and they will also foster the recovery from the crisis. So it is a tool to enhance companies' capacity to build and increase resilience, and it is also a tool to ensure a fairer and more inclusive distribution, and at the end of the day, a contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. So in my capacity, of course, as the chair of the OECD Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct, it is equally encouraging and exciting to see so many ongoing initiatives building on the standards that we have, not reinventing the wheel. And by the standards that we have, I do, of course, mean the UN guiding principles in the first place, the OECD guidelines, and the ILO declaration. So I think it's critical that at this time we focus on international cooperation, that we focus on a level playing field that was mentioned many times this morning, and that we do focus on coherence. So the big question, of course, is simple. How do we get there? How do we get there? Is there a recipe for success when it comes to policymakers? What are the ingredients for a common approach? The topic of this forum, a common approach to sustainable supply chains and due diligence. With this question, we now turn to our speakers and hear their views. Our first speaker is Helen Dontwan. She is Director for Economic Affairs at the Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs in France. Helen, the floor is yours. Helen?
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to thank you for this this statement, and I wanted also to thank the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development for convening this event. It's a pleasure and a privilege to attend and to hear so many ideas and points of view on these issues, which are of a lot of importance for us. I must say, from a personal point of view, I really like the opening sentence about the fact that the world needs a new business model, and I find it very, very encouraging in these dark times. I'd like to make 4 points. My first point is to say that France fully supports the principle of legislating at the EU level on human, social, and environmental due diligence requirements, and that we support the objectives which are set forth by the Commission. My second point is to say that we are still working on the content and our contribution on the public consultation. So I don't want to be too fast in contributing to the debate on that. But I can already say that we, of course, fully support the twofold objective of creating a level playing field in Europe and of being ambitious. I've heard in the previous panels the debate about the need for horizontal measures, which we share, and also the need for a differentiated approach for SMEs, and the difficulties that have been described by previous speakers for small companies. We hear this, and it's a delicate point of finding the right measures to honor this issue and find solution to the difficulties of smaller companies. We are interested in the debate on the creation of national supervisory authorities as well. We think the level of engagement with stakeholders is an important issue. At least it is in France, because there are different frameworks that can be used for the companies to contribute to this legislation. And we also believe that the level of liability and the level of transparency which are required can be very important with regard to competition outside the EU. My third point would be, as you yourself said, and it has been said in the previous panels as well, that we should not reinvent the wheel. And we certainly on a national level are committed to the existing guidelines and principle. And I think we can also give them an even stronger influence through this current discussion that we're having. International normative reference in terms of responsible business conduct do exist, and they must be utilized as they provide the framework for any legislation on RBC. You enumerated them, so This is, I think, where I am fully in agreement with you on this issue. And my fourth point would be maybe more national. From a national standpoint, we are really committed to a regulation of globalization, as you know, and the improvement of living and working conditions. We have been setting in place global framework agreements. We support the global deal to foster social dialogue. We are committed to becoming a pioneer country with the Alliance 8.7 to combat forced and child labor. And we have been putting last year at the G7 the issues of social inequalities at the top of our international agenda. In national terms, we are trying as well to walk the talk, and we've been doing so for quite a few years now, starting with the law on vigilance. I don't know how that would translate, but which was adopted in 2017, and which, if you want, I can provide more information about, but it basically sets out the idea that companies and large companies should have a plan to prevent violation and to organize due diligence. And this effort has been pursued through the recent, in 2019, PACT law, which has been changing also the framework in terms of what are the aim of a company. A company must pursue its social interest, and this social interest must take into account what is at stake in social terms and in environmental terms. So this being now in the French law has consequences. And it goes with a number of other legislative provisions that have been adopted as well, which are linked actually to the very purpose of the companies. We've been interested in the international growing debate about purpose in terms of companies. I think also a lot of people in France are looking for this purpose as well. And the debate we're having on the dignity at work is linked to this will to have more meaning in the work we are doing every day. So, sorry, it was pretty poorly explained, but I hope you get my point. I take a lot of comfort in hearing so many interventions for people who are like-minded. It's almost regrettable that we are not more people who are not like-minded, but I guess this we might encounter later on in our efforts to push these issues in the global debate. I think it's very important to take the issues beyond the European borders, as you mentioned, Christine. And so I'm looking forward to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I think that was an excellent account of both the European dimension, how it refers to France, and then, of course, the various initiatives France has been undertaking in the field of responsible business conduct. Last but not least, the Loi Pacte, which really goes into the direction of a new business model. I'm conscious of time, so without further ado, I would like to hand over to our second speaker, Salla Sastamoinen, who is the Acting Director General at the Director General for Justice and Consumers in the European Commission. Salla, I'm sure you have been intrigued by the different contributions this morning, and of course we would now like to hear from you more specifically. What are your plans and how do you react to the different interventions this morning? Salla, please.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you to the German presidency of taking this very topical subject to your conference list. It has been indeed very interesting to listen. And I would actually stress that point that in the Commission, we are currently very much in the listening mode. on the subject. The State Secretary Sumugori said that it should be a participatory consultative process, and this is precisely what we are currently carrying on the considering the future initiative on the sustainable corporate governance. So we have in the Commission the overall objective of the just transition to the sustainable economy, to a sustainable recovery after the COVID crisis. And it is in this framework, indeed, that the Commission work program now for next year envisaged the making the proposal, a legislative proposal on the sustainable corporate governance. It should come out on the second quarter of 21. And much of this you have also heard already this morning from Commissioner Reinders, who is giving the political lead to this exercise. In our side, as civil servants, we have prepared the matter. We have evidence from the evaluations, studies, research that shows that the current voluntary action and the reporting has not succeeded in driving companies towards the sustainable value creation and not sufficiently to the responsible behavior. We heard today already companies who are explaining how they are functioning in a responsible way. What we see that doesn't cover all the companies, not all the businesses. So that's what we would want to bring forward. We find indeed that the business plays a very important role on in facing the current problems that we have, whether it's environmental, climate, or social sustainability problems. We have made references already to the pandemic time and the crisis, which has revealed the lack of resilience in the companies. And what we think that when working with the sustainable corporate governance, that's also one way of addressing the issue of the resilience, including social, labor, human rights issues, and also in the global supply chains. Our future initiative is currently still under preparation. We have what we have published was the Inception impact assessment. And there, on that basis, you can see that we are aiming to bringing or improving our regulatory framework in 3 ways. First, we want to enable the companies and their directors to focus on the long-term sustainable value creation rather than the short-term benefits. Longer term makes the thinking more sustainable. Second, what we aim is to better align the interest of the companies, their shareholders, managers, stakeholders, including their employees, and the society. So that way, having the broader thinking on the interests of the companies. And thirdly, what we aim is to help the companies to better manage sustainability-related matters in their own operations, in their value chains. What we are looking this issue way. What I mean that we are looking it from the perspectives indeed of the 3 what I said earlier, ESG, environmental, social governance, environmental governing the climate aspects, because these are then naturally on the political priorities of the Commission. As I said, we are in a very consultative phase currently. We had received the first results of the public consultation that we did on the renewed sustainable finance strategy last year. And that already shows a strong overall support for the, for example, to directors to take stakeholder interest into account. And what we have also learned indeed in the public consultations, that there is general support, and that way I take what Helen just mentioned, that we are here very many like-minded views, but that is confirmed also in the public consultations. What we have currently doing, our broad public consultation going on, launched in October and going until February. I also was happy to hear that many have mentioned that they are preparing their contributions. So we are looking forward on those. So all that is then part of the impact assessment process that we are carrying out. This is part of the better regulation process that we do in order to base any initiatives on the evidence, on the views of the stakeholders. The consultation brings those views of the stakeholders. And as for the other material, we have already carried out studies on the due diligence of requirements, as well as on the duties of the directors. So we have that type of the material that we are then basing on. So in general, what we are thinking that the lessons learned so far from the voluntary standards is that wasn't sufficient. We need to go further, and we will need to work indeed all together from the Europe and from outside of taking the best possible basis for this future work. And I'm very, again, thank you indeed for having been invited to this panel and to the conference, because as I said, it's very good to listen indeed any input that we are currently getting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sala. Maybe just one follow-up question. You mentioned several times the relevance of ESG criteria for obvious reasons. We also heard this morning some concerns among business that we now have ESG, we have sustainability, then we have the UNGPs, we have the OECD guidelines. And it would be interesting to hear from you how you're going to accommodate the existing international standards into the new EU legislation. Are there any plans or methodology, how you're going to align with these standards to make sure that you are in fact not reinventing the wheel?
Thank you. Yes, we aim to take into account the standards that are existing. For example, in the area of the social rights, labor rights, there are ILO indeed conventions that we are taking into account as a basis. On the other hand, it is true that on the environmental side, on climate side, biodiversity side, on that broad, we still have to also work on the on making the general level international standards very concrete. So we are working together with our colleagues from the Directorate General Environment, Directorate General Climate, for example, on the better calculating the various footprints on that side. So we are developing also that aspect at the same time. But naturally, the international work that is there is basis. What I would still say that we are international work. We have many of our countries or member states are committed to that. What we have seen that, for example, that these member states have still not then taken alone all that legislation. For example, the UN guiding principles say that member states would consider the due diligence legislation, and that's not there. So that way, it's not only that international makes the basis. That's why we need to look at it also from the European perspective. But this is very international. This is certainly a global cross-border area. So what we have to also think that if we are creating framework for our European companies, it has to take into account also the impact outside of Europe, and it has to take also impact of the competitiveness. So we have to put that in the together in the balanced way, and that's why indeed, for example, the current public consultations are very important to get all type of the input.
Thank you very much, Sala. I think that was just a perfect connection to our next speaker, Dante Pesce, who is the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Dante, I'm sure you can come in now with the UNGP's perspective, but also the big question, of course, we're talking about a European standard. How does it refer to countries outside of the European Union? What are its impacts? Dante, please.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, and thank you for the German government and their presidency of Europe for inviting me to address this audience. I'm from the Global South. I live in Chile, where I'm from. And so the interventions in the first session resonated for me greatly. And I will make some specific contributions to this discussion. But first of all, I would like to say that Rubana, Fernanda, and Sharon made a lot of sense for me. But also the second session with SMEs on board. My mother is an entrepreneur, 160 employees, now really struggling to survive. But I have, let's say, her spirit in my blood somehow, but also the experience of knowing how is to run an SME in troubling circumstances. And and also the value of associations to build collaboration and to make it work, and also the enlightenment of large companies moving ahead of the curve, but realizing that needs to get everyone on board. One thing that I want to mention also is that we need to avoid a global patchwork of policy measures. So you in Western Europe, or actually in the European context, are working in putting coherence together in a policy framework that can make sense and avoid a patchwork of measures. But from where I stand as the working group, we need to take care of the global patchwork of measures, and also recognizing that we are in different stages, levels of maturity and understanding, etc., and need to avoid the misperception or conception of neo-protectionism or Western imposition of culture that is often being raised where I live, but also around my African and Asian colleagues often. So I'm just signaling that we need to work together to avoid this wrong conception and actually confront it with good arguments. And also one comment also, which is very good, I think, is that when Johanna was mentioning, the Minister of Finland was mentioning about how to develop a global strategy. We are developing a global strategy on business and human rights. And actually the working group is leading a 10th year stock-taking exercise and building a strategy for the next 10 years and beyond, which is exactly that, a global plan of action, and where we need to combine efforts and to make and synchronize efforts in a way that can make sense for all the world on different stages, let's say, and speed. And finally, one point about business participation. Last week, we had the annual forum on business and human rights, and we had 40% business participation. So very clearly, there are practical, tangible indications that not only civil society, unions, indigenous people are on board in this agenda, but actually business is becoming on board more and more, and we have the data to support that. But our governments are still behind the curve. With the exception of you in Western Europe, in some parts of Western Europe, I will say not all Western Europe, the rest of the world, our governments lay behind. And that's a big call for you and how to strategize together and how to incentivize the needed political will that is not necessarily there yet. And clearly, moral sanctions not work in reality and do not drive change in reality for our policymakers at the national level. So that's, let's say, reactions to what have been said. So the working group on business and human rights that I represent has a mandate from the Human Rights Council to push the global implementation of the guiding principles. Under the guiding principles, all business enterprises have a responsibility to respect human rights. And the process of continuously conducting human rights due diligence is a core requirement for business all over the world. The UNGPs also set out the legal and policy implications for how to operationalize the state duty to protect through a smart mix of measures that includes legally binding measures, particularly where voluntary measures continue to leave significant gaps in human rights protection. Indeed, the guiding principles anticipated the development of mandatory measures that codify the expectations of the guiding principles into hard law. The consensus among participants across all sectors and all geographies at last week's forum is that laws are coming. Our future is one of mandatory measures. We now have a strong evidence base that voluntary measures aren't getting us where we need to be. The working group has issued recommendations to the EU in this context of legislative proposal, and it's great that you are leading by putting your house in order first. Let me highlight some key points, and it's critical for mandatory measures too. Drive coherence across efforts. It is essential that legal developments are based on the key expectations set out by the guiding principles and align with the due diligence guidance by the UN guiding principles, OECD and ILO. Do not reinvent the wheel, but also be clear that you are using globally accepted standards. be based on meaningful and inclusive stakeholder consultations, including with stakeholders affected by and involved with the full value chain, and apply to both groups, extraterritorial operations and business relationships. For example, my Chilean government, but also exporters associations and local stakeholders could be part and should be part of that consultation, since they are going to be directly impacted by the future legislation. You can raise awareness in the context of ongoing political dialogue, maybe connect with regional platforms that have been put in place for the sake of pushing the business and human rights agenda in Asia, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, etc. Avoid actively the potential misperception of Western cultural imposition or new forms of protectionism. Apply to the government as an economic actor is part of both vertical and horizontal policy coherence, including procurement and state-owned enterprises. And on policy coherence, you have many tools to harmonize first and use it as leverage later, such as trade and commerce and cooperation for development. Go beyond reporting regimes and require meaningful processes and outcomes. Require business to take measures that facilitate access to effective justice and remedy. Set out clear compliance, monitoring, and enforcement structures and procedures that facilitate access to effective justice and remedy. Building on regulatory responses is a key issue for the working group's ongoing effort to develop a roadmap to advance implementation on the UN guiding principles in the next decade through the UNGP's 10+ project, by the way, supported politically and financially by the German government and the Finnish government. We look forward to continued engagement with the German Council presidency and other stakeholders to envision a coherent and effective way forward. Thank you very much, Christine, and the floor is back to you.
Thank you, Dante. Thank you very much. I think you covered a lot, and I would also encourage interested participants to read actually the letter that the UN Working Group sent to the European Union Commission about its impact for the forthcoming legislation. I would now like to turn to our next speaker, who is Caroline Collau. She's the Trade Policy and Economic Governance Director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. Caroline, if I could ask you to report and tell us a bit about your experience in the Netherlands with various initiatives for mandatory due diligence requirements. And if I could also ask you to keep your intervention as short as possible, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I assume you can hear me? Yes. Thank you very much, Christine. And let me also thank the German presidency for organizing this very important event, but also the Commission for their effort to put the RBC high on the European agenda. We think it's very important, and so it's very welcome. Last month, the Netherlands has completed an extended period of evaluation, consultation, and research. And we have renewed our policy and responsible business conduct. I'm happy to share a few of our insights with you and the plans going forward. Until now, Dutch policy, as you may be aware, has been of a voluntary nature. And the main element in this responsible business conduct policy was multi-stakeholder agreement between relevant parties. We have in the past year conducted extensive evaluation of these agreements and of the type of policy that we have in place. We have used the results of the consultation and the evaluation to design the new responsible business conduct policy. The main conclusion of the evaluation that we've conducted was that the RBC policies on a voluntary basis, as we have them, are not sufficient. We have not been able to address sufficient companies. Actually, in high-risk sectors, we've only been able to address a small percentage of the businesses with these voluntary agreements. So we have concluded that we need new and improved measures, and we need an element of mandatory measures as well. As was said before, we have in all the research that we've done, concluded that there is the need for a smart mix of measures, because we cannot address with just a due diligence obligation the diverse group of businesses that we're trying to reach. For instance, the front runners that we know have a different need and a different approach than the businesses that are not yet up to speed. So we have agreed on mutually reinforcing measures that together should lead to an effective change in company behavior. A key element, as I said, is a general due diligence obligation. And based on the studies and consultations we've conducted, we're convinced that this will be more effective on an EU level than it would be on a national level. For instance, for reasons of level playing field, but also for the impact that it will have in producing countries. We are working in the Netherlands on the building blocks for such an obligation. And we will provide those building blocks as input to the Commission to help think on how such a due diligence obligation should look. And since the requirements for national obligations will in the end be rather similar, we feel that should, in the unfortunate event, there not be an EU-wide policy effective due diligence obligation, we will use the same building blocks to go for legislation at a national level. Other measures in our smart mix conclude RBC conditions to apply for government instruments and to take part in government procurement, financial incentives for companies, encouragement and support for sectoral cooperation between the relevant stakeholders. And we think there's a need to set up an RBC support office as a single point of entry to support the services for businesses in applying the RBC norms. This is where we currently stand. Happy to answer one or two questions if there is time. I would like to point out that much of our material is available in English, so should anyone be interested, we're happy to provide it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I think that is a fascinating account of how you manage to have two processes going on in parallel, the domestic national process, where you define the building blocks that could inform future legislation, while at the same time making sure that you're coherent with the upcoming European Union regulation and feeding these building blocks into that process. I was also intrigued because you mentioned how important it is to set incentives for business. That was an issue that several of the speakers this morning mentioned as being crucial, and it would be interesting to maybe know a bit more of what you have in mind there, how to ensure business buy-in. Obviously, you have a tradition already with the agreements, but I would assume that especially with SMEs, it's not that easy and it's not obvious that they are on board.
Yes, in terms of the incentives, I think there's a few things, the voluntary agreements and support that we also provide as a government. And there is funding available, especially for the smaller companies, to be able to engage in responsible business conduct, especially in the voluntary agreements that we currently use. I think what's more important for future reference is the single point of entry. The support unit that we're trying to establish, that would be a single point of entry, not only for funding purposes, but also for advice, exchanging best practices, having support and help right there. Because we think that that's needed if you were to impose an obligation on companies, they would need some assistance in how to best address this. And it's a step-by-step approach in which we hope that companies can grow in improving as they go along. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think this will be a common feature, this single point of entry. opportunity also for companies to get all the information, and it will of course also foster coherence within the government, because it requires government to coordinate, which, as we all know, is not an easy task to manage in practice. And I'm very pleased now that we have our last speaker with us. It's Anna Cavazzini. She was in a session of the Parliament and was not able to join us from the beginning. Anna is a member of the European Parliament, and I'm very happy, Anna, that we have you with us. I would like to give you the floor to offer your comments and maybe also give us an idea of what your priorities are. Please.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting panel. I listened to the last speakers with a lot of attention, and I think this debate about mandatory due diligence is really fascinating, and I think it is really a good. It can be a trigger for making globalization fair and more just and more sustainable, and this is why it's so promising. In the European Parliament, as you probably know, we have since years a group of members of the European Parliament from different groups who are fighting for mandatory due diligence. And in a lot of different occasions, in plenary resolutions, the Parliament had already asked for introducing mandatory due diligence on EU level. I think there is also a great coherence or commitment to a horizontal approach to liability and to a lot of factors that had been mentioned by the previous speakers. So this is very, very interesting. But as such, the European Parliament has not decided yet on a comprehensive position. So in a lot of resolutions, we call for mandatory due diligence, and this very active cross-group working group of parliamentarians has a clear vision of how mandatory diligence should be designed on EU level. But so far, the Parliament is about to discuss its position, and this is very interesting. I come to that in a second. What I find also important to mention is that I think the national debates and the European debates are very interesting and are really getting involved with each other and also inspiring each other. I think it is very good that, for example, on German level or on French level, on Dutch level, there is already a legislation, or in Germany there hopefully will be one. I'm really not understanding arguments of people who say that, for example, in Germany we don't need a legislation because there will be at some point EU legislation. First of all, I think on EU level, we all know that it takes time. It's not that we will have this legislation ready by next year. So second, I think it is interesting also for us on EU level, and probably the colleague from the Commission can confirm that we learn from the experience from the national level. And I think we have seen it during the German EU presidency. That is, of course, very, very interesting to learn also from the debates we're having in Germany, and including now debate experience from the other countries who have already mandatory due diligence legislation. So I think this is, for me, it is important that we make progress on all the levels. This is my first point. Second point, I can quickly summarize the debate so far in the European Parliament. We had already a vote in the Trade Committee, which is, I think, quite interesting. One of you also mentioned the question of what happens to other countries or what happens to imports. And in the Trade Committee, we clearly say that we also want to have due diligence applied to imported products and want to work with other countries. We have also asked in this decision of the Trade Committee, and this is probably also something we could discuss here, an additional rule next to mandatory due diligence that basically says products that are made with forced labor or child labor should not enter at all in the EU market, because this is even a more severe violation of human rights, and there we should be even stricter. We had a vote already in the Human Rights Committee, which is also an opinion-giving committee, that voted for clear liability rules, because I think this is often also the huge debate: do we include liability or not? It has also been debated with a lot of heat in my committee, and not all the groups are in favor, just to say that, but just, yeah, the Human Rights Committee voted in favor. Both committee, the Human Rights and the Trade Committee, said that it is not only about tier 1. So the supply chain is bigger than only tier 1. So this is also a clear signal. We still have to see what is the outcome in the leading URI committee, like the Legal Affairs Committee, and there the vote is still up, and the debates on the compromises are happening. But I think it's very fascinating. So almost the whole, not the whole parliament, but a lot of committees were interested, wanted to give an opinion. It's a very hot topic in the parliament for a lot of MEPs, which is a very good sign, I think. And of course, as the European Parliament, we try to already also give our input to the Commission proposal. And this is the whole goal of this exercise. And then we are just also waiting with a lot of impatience for the legislative proposal next year from the Commission. And yeah, one more thing I can probably tell you, but I'm sure all of you know about it. We had also an additional vote in the European Parliament 2 months ago, I believe, on mandatory due diligence when it comes to deforestation. So I think what is interesting, I think the majority of the European Parliament is very clear that we want a horizontal approach, absolutely. But there is also the idea that in some areas, in some sectors that are more risk prone, it is probably better to have an additional or like a stronger rules. And the Parliament decided on a legislative own initiative report that basically also says we should not put products that are linked to deforestation on the EU market, and we need proper due diligence for these forest risk commodities. It's probably, if you haven't seen it, it's probably interesting to have a look at this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think that was just a perfect overview of all the issues that were being discussed this morning. You started with the question of how to make progress on all different levels. And if I'm trying to summarize or to take the key takeaways, since we're running out of time, I came up with 5 takeaways. And I think the first one is a very important one. It's really that stakeholders need to be included, and not only in the drafting of future legislation, but already in the evaluation. I think the Finnish minister made that very clear how important that is. It was mentioned by France, by the Netherlands. Second point, we all agree that voluntary measures are not enough. And that, of course, immediately leads to the issue of the smart mix, which everybody agrees. But the big question is how to balance that smart mix. And I think there was a general consensus for horizontal approach with a general due diligence obligation. It was also very clear that flexibility is needed, flexibility for businesses that are maybe less advanced, less mature, but especially also for SMEs. And that could mean that there are different requirements, different levels of requirements, but it could also mean that maybe more flexibility can be achieved with some non-binding instruments that are very well connected with a legally binding standard. It was very clear also that if we have general due diligence requirements, that they will be more effective on I'll put it like this, international level, of course at the European Union level, but we also need to look globally, and especially when we think about global value chains and we think about leveling the playing field, we think about consumer interests, we think about the impact on the ground, then the question really is it enough to only look at the European level, or do we need to go further? And that would be my fourth point. We have several dimensions that we need to consider. The domestic one is an obvious one. Then we have the regional one with the single market, which is also an obvious entry point for mandatory due diligence requirements, but we also have the global dimension. And this is where the global standards, of course, play a very important role, because we can build on some standards that have already been agreed upon. And it was mentioned by one of our business representatives, the legal counsel from Ericsson, that this also requires that we understand, that we fully understand the instruments that we have, that we know what environment protection, for example, means, that we know what due diligence requirements mean. And there we have already some guidance with the UNGPs and, of course, the OECD due diligence guidance. And the fifth point is really that was emphasized by many this morning, is how to set incentives for companies. And setting incentives for companies to engage is essential if you want to avoid a checking the box approach. So and we also want to avoid that companies are just complying with the absolute minimum that is required by the law. We still want the progressive one to actually push the agenda and move further. So this is why incentives here play a very important role, and they also play an important role in enabling SMEs, for example, with what was mentioned by the Netherlands, a single point of entry. So with this, I would just like to thank all the speakers on this panel. It was great. I wish we had more time for a real discussion, and I hand back now to Christine.
Thank you very much to all the panelists, and to you, Christine, for moderating and for wrapping up with the 5 takeaways. I think that was a very, very excellent summary. We have almost now reached the end of a very interesting virtual conference, but there is another highlight coming. Dr. Maria Flaxbart, our Parliamentary State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, has always been a strong supporter of responsible business conduct. State Secretary, we had this morning very intense and very interesting discussions among representatives of governments, civil society and businesses. And we are now looking forward to your closing remarks and your outlook. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine Tötzke, ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Sumivori. I've just had the chance just to listen to your panel for a short time, and it was very, very interesting and very, very impressive. And now just let me present some conclusions from the German point of view. Again, this morning you have heard Norbert Bartle, my colleague, and now I would like to add some points. As we all know, COVID-19 is putting our global economy activities to the test. Global supply chains have been disrupted because production facilities have been closed and demand for consumer goods, such as clothing, has been dropping. Many people are losing their jobs and wages without any social safety nets to fall back on, or they have to work without any protective measures, facing an increased risk of infection. This means that we have to change the way we run our economies in future. Today's discussion has confirmed this. Only if we lay down binding rules for corporate due diligence in global supply chains, we will be able to live up to our common social and environmental responsibility. Sustainable global supply chains make good economic sense. A business that implements health and safety standards and pays fair wages invests in the most important capital it has, its staff. Clean products are increasingly becoming a critical success factor for business, and social and environmental risks are increasingly being taken into account in business ratings. We must not accept that people toil in terrible conditions in factories and on large plantations to satisfy our consumer desires, including 70 million children in developing countries. The question is, how do we have to run our economies in order to ensure this? The answer can only be in a socially and environmentally sustainable way. Enterprises have to fulfill their corporate due diligence obligations in their supply chains. Enterprises have to produce in an environmentally sound and resource-saving way. From 2 representative surveys in business in Germany, we learned that individual voluntary commitments alone are unfortunately insufficient. We need a smart mix of binding rules and voluntary initiatives at the national and international levels, especially at the European level. To that end, we need an EU action plan to strengthen corporate social responsibility in global supply chains. Policymakers have to create a sustainable, a suitable framework for this, a framework that encourages and challenges companies to meet their due diligence obligations in their supply chains. All this must follow the principle of putting empowerment before withdrawal. This is very, very important for us. Here is an example. Some companies fear that they will be unable to meet their due diligence obligations with regard to supply chains. So they choose to withdraw from developing countries. Our advice to these companies is no, remain on the ground. Pulling out would be wrong. Developing countries need your support to develop environmentally and socially sound value chains. My ministry supports such companies through our help desk on business and human rights. There we give you customized free advice. We show you ways in which your company can meet its human rights due diligence obligations in developing countries and emerging economies. And the help desk is also a place for close and open dialogue between enterprises, policymakers, and civil society. The help desk has met with great interest. So far, 800 companies have turned to us, from micro enterprises all the way to DAX stock index corporations. Starting in 2021, the help desk will be providing tailor-made free training courses on specific topics for companies and their suppliers. So we would like to encourage you, business, NGOs, and representatives of EU member states, make use of our help desk and feel free to tell others about it. In December, we will launch another tool, our SME Compass. This is an information portal that will assist small and medium-sized enterprises in getting started on due diligence process. It will provide how-to guides, tips, and practical tools, online, Pacific, free of charge in English and German. And of course, we are continuing our active work for the textile partnership. We launched the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles in 2014 after the Rana Plaza disaster. The partnership units a large number of textile companies, business associations, NGOs, unions, standard organizations, and the German government on a voluntary basis. They have joined forces in order to gradually improve conditions in textile production, from the production of raw materials all the way to disposal, from living wages all the way to general standards for wastewater management. So let us combine our efforts for swiftly introducing corporate due diligence rules at the European level. Let us redouble our efforts for an EU action plan to strengthen corporate social responsibility in global supply chains. Today's discussion has provided significant input to the coming EU debate on regulating corporate due diligence, and thank you for that very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Flaxbart, for these very clear and very encouraging concluding remarks. I would also like to thank all speakers for taking part in this discussion. I think we all gained a lot of new insights and hopefully also a lot of inspirations to take the debate on this very important topic forward. Also, thanks to all of you who followed the event online. Many of our speakers contributed to the compendium Phil Bloomer presented today, and you will find this document online as well as the video of today's virtual forum. We also kindly invite all of you to share your feedback on the event via the participant survey, which you also can find on the event webpage. And with these words, I say goodbye and close the virtual forum.